So we're going to spend a little bit more time on this idea, on the implications for theories of visual consciousness. And so in class, we talked about potential explanations for how we can essentially experience visual consciousness. So we talked about the fact that vision can be described and explained by having a short-lived representation that constantly gets refreshed and rewritten every time we experience our environment, which would explain why we miss things and why we have change blindness, is because it's constantly getting refreshed. We talked about having detailed representations of the visual world around us, but we don't compare new scenes very well. We don't compare them properly, and that could explain why we tend to be victims of inattentional blindness and change blindness. There's explanations for the fact that perhaps we see the whole scene and our sensory memory sees things, but then we think that we extract all meaningful information and then we move on and we don't think back to what we originally saw. We could also talk about the idea that we see the world as just a brief kind of fleeting gist, right? And so our brain fills in the gaps. We never really form a complete representation of the world around us. The scene around us is rapidly changing, our environment's rapidly changing, and so we actually depend on the world to be our external memory. And so one thing that we have to think about as a potential explanation in addition to this is that it's just a virtual representation, and that perhaps we see everything as our quote unquote reality, and the brain is just filling in all of the gaps in the sense that vision is just this grand illusion. And there is no really detailed representation of the world. Our vision is just the perceptual experience of our brain kind of filling in the gaps. So this brings us this idea as, is consciousness an illusion, right? Is vision an illusion? Okay, this brings us to this kind of line of thinking and comparing visual consciousness to the experience of illusions. O'Regan and Noe argued that the classical theories of vision don't really explain much about the hard problem, right? How do we have this internal representation? How does that give rise to visual consciousness? And we know that we see vision is a way for us to explore the environment. It's a way of acting, but O'Regan and Noe take it a step further. And with their sensorimotor theory, basically say that seeing, attending, experiencing, everything is all just a form of, it's an action. It's not necessarily a separate process. It's not necessarily something that you can distinguish or tease apart. The idea behind sensorimotor theory is that you have an organism that has like all of the hardware, right? So you have an animal that has the ability to see, and then has photoreceptors. It has the areas in the brain that coordinate to vision, all of that happening. But it's not until the animal is able to experience a higher level of cognition to where we can say that the animal is, for example, experiencing a feel, right? And you can actually take this and translate this from an animal in the sense, or not an animal, but a robot, in the sense that you say, well, a robot could have all of the hardware to be able to visually see or visually experience pain, because you have all the mechanisms in place, like a loop that you would see in a human. But does it feel pain? Is the subjective experience of pain there? Does it feel, not just is it a closed loop reaction? And so O'Regan and Noe would say that if the robot has the capacity to have this higher level of cognition, then we can't deny that that particular robot actually does experience pain. Another question that we can ask here and think about, which I like the sensorimotor theory because it takes it away from necessarily just humans. We can actually look at other animals in this same sense about having sort of the quote unquote sensory hardware. Does it have the capacity to understand and connect what is going on into a subjective experience? And if that's the case, then all that organism needs to do is explore its environment and can have these experiences and these feels. If we think about humans, right? So humans are limited to the sensory hardware that we have, right? And we can see because we have these photoreceptors, we can hear because we have all of the auditory processing systems, et cetera, et cetera. And if you think about other animals, for example, there are animals like dolphins who can echolocate. There are insects that can see ultraviolet light. There are snakes that can sense heat, and like the predator, right? Looking off in the distance and seeing an animal give off a heat signature. Humans can't do that. Humans don't have that experience, therefore they aren't able, they have the higher level cognition, but they can't put those two things together because we lack the sensory ability to do that. And if we think about what is reality, what is reality? I want to kind of move into this idea of a default reality. So in order for something to be an illusion, there needs to be some default reality for us to have this misconception or misperception. Our default reality, humans, is very specific to what we're able to experience in terms of subjective experience. And so if we look at a flower and we all see this flower and we say, it's this color, and this is what we all agree on as being our reality. If you bring in another organism, like for example, a bee, who's looking at this flower and not seeing it as this, let's say it's a purple flower, a bee might see it differently in a different ultraviolet, because it can see ultraviolet spectrum, might actually see this completely differently. And so it's hard to argue that a default reality exists when there are so many other organisms that can interpret what their environment looks like, or is like, sounds like, feels like, whatever it might be. So in order for us to discuss and argue that a default reality exists, in order for us to do that and to think about, is consciousness an illusion? In order for us to say that it's an illusion, we would have to then say, well, there is a reality that exists, that there is a default that exists. And in order for us to be experiencing it as an illusion, that means that we're mistaken about, we're misperceiving what the reality is. But the question is there a reality to be mistaken about? And if you just flip it and say consciousness instead of reality, does consciousness actually exist as its own thing? Think about it like the light inside of the fridge. When you open the fridge door, the light is on, but when you close the door, is the light still on? If the same age-old question, if a tree falls in a forest and there's nobody there to hear it, does it make a sound? So if there is no right and wrong, if there is no default baseline reality, if there is no default baseline consciousness, can we argue that consciousness is in fact an illusion? So, further things to think about, because I want you to consider in your discussion post this idea of what is reality and reality, default reality, right? And don't just consider the human perspective, because unless you consider that humans are the only organism that it can experience consciousness, we can't deny other organisms' experiences. So the idea of a reality and a real default reality would have to be based off of not just our experience. So I want you to think about this, and I want you to think about, is consciousness an illusion? Does it exist? Is there a reality of consciousness? So hopefully you're able to take kind of what we've been talking about this whole time and give some thought to this and try to decide where you fall on the spectrum.